Well, a very pleasant good evening or good afternoon to you, everybody. I hope you're having an excellent day out there, whatever you're doing right now. It's a beautiful day here in Southern California, so thank you for joining us. We have a really great show for you today. We've got Magda Havas on the line, and she'll be talking about electromagnetic, I can say that, radiation. And so this is going to be a really, really good show. So thanks for joining us. Currently, we are doing 3 shows per week on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So thank you for joining us today. Today is Monday, October 22nd, 2012. And this is episode number 25. So you could find this show at extremehealthradio.com/25. And on that show page, excuse me, there will be a transcription and show notes with websites and reference materials and all that good stuff. So please check out that show page. And also, if you have a question for our guests or for me, just email them to me at justin@extremehealthradio.com. I'd love to hear from you. Or you could call our voicemail line, which is 949-391-7363, and I will play your message to our guest live on the air. And also, I wanted to let you know this show is brought to you by Less EMF, and they're a great website selling lots of great electromagnetic radiation items, over 300 items. So check out that at extremehealthradio.com/lessEMF. They're sort of the one-stop shop for this type of information. So before we introduce Magda Havas, I just want to give you a brief rundown on the show, on the upcoming show schedule. We've got Dr. Mark Circus out of Brazil, and he's a prolific guy, director of the International Medical Veritas Association. He's written some amazing books on cancer and heart disease and diseases like that. We've got Dr. Jack Tips next Friday, who's a prolific individual himself. And we've got Danny Roddy on the following Monday, and he talks a lot about stress, and he's a big fan of Dr. Ray Peat and looking into his work. So that should be fun. So make sure to join us for those shows. I would like to introduce Magda Havas. She is the Associate Professor of the Environmental and Resources Study at Trent University. She teaches and does research on the biological effects of environmental contaminants. And she received her PhD from the University of Toronto, completed a postdoctoral research at Cornell University, and taught at the University of Toronto before going to Trent University in Petersburg, Canada. And she is the author with Camilla Reese of Public Health SOS, The Shadow Side of the Wireless Revolution. So thank you so much, Magda, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Justin.
So you are calling in from Canada, is that right?
That's right.
Excellent. And so when did you publish that book? That sounds interesting to me, The Shadow Side of the Wireless Revolution.
That came out a few years ago after we held a Commonwealth Club meeting in San Francisco, and it was based on questions that the audience had. We asked them to, write their questions on little cards, and there was so much interest that we didn't have a chance to answer all of their questions at the meeting. And so Camilla and I decided to put the questions in a book and answer them there and make them available to anyone interested.
Wow, and so people can get that book on Amazon, or where can they buy that?
Amazon.com, yes.
Excellent, excellent.
And price is $20, so it's not very expensive at all.
Oh, great, great. So now you've been involved. I was going through your website recently, and you've got a lot of great videos on there and articles. So you've been involved in this for many, many years.
Yes, I have.
What initially got you involved in this type of research?
Well, the research I was doing prior to electromagnetic radiation was on chemical toxicants in the environment. I'm an environmental toxicologist, and I worked on air quality and water quality, and particularly the effects of acid rain on aquatic ecosystems. I worked at Cornell, as you mentioned. I worked in the Canadian Arctic. I worked in Ontario at smelter sites. And one of the courses that I teach at Trent University is called Pollution Ecology, where we deal with different types of environmental contaminants and teach the students, where they come from, how they're transformed in the environment, and what effects they have on the environment, and what can be done to mitigate those effects. And I was reading some studies on childhood leukemia. Kids who lived near power lines had a greater risk of developing leukemia. And the authors thought that it was associated with the electromagnetic fields coming from power lines. And so I thought, well, this would be a totally new topic to introduce into the course. Began reading the literature and found that it was really all over the place. This was back in the early 90s. And then some people were saying, this is a very serious problem. And other people were saying, well, all the studies, that have been done are flawed in some way. And so I felt that the science wasn't yet at a stage, where I could teach about it in a way that really made sense to the students, apart from introducing them to a lot of controversy, which can also be useful. And one day, my husband went to visit his brother in Wales, who's an engineer. And one night they were out walking his dog, and my brother-in-law pulled out a fluorescent tube when they were walking near a power plant, and he held it up under the high voltage transmission lines, and the tube lit up. And he was sort of doing this to, impress his younger brother. And when my husband came home and told me about it, I got quite excited. And we went out to the nearby transmission line. And I did the same thing, and the tube lit up. And what was really fascinating to me is it only lit up to where my hand held it. So if you pointed it towards the sky and you grabbed the tube in the middle, only part lit up and the bottom part was dark. And so I wanted to understand what was going on. And I went to a physics professor in our university, a friend of mine, and I explained this to him, and he said, everyone knows that happens. And I said, well, not everyone. It was new to me. And he began to explain to me what was going on. And I recall asking him a specific question. I said, do you think this could contribute to childhood leukemia? And it was really his answer that caused me to look into this a lot more carefully. And his answer was definitely not. It definitely can't contribute to childhood leukemia. And when I asked him what he based that evidence, that information on, he said the frequency is too low to cause any damage to the cell. And so then I thought, well, if that's where the theory is, that it's theoretically not possible for this relationship, but if the evidence is showing something contrary, then we have to readjust the theory. We have to reinvest theory. And that's what I decided to do. So I went and scoured the literature. I went through all the childhood leukemia studies, found that indeed there was a relationship that was worth, examining in greater detail, that the studies were not bogus, that were finding these adverse effects. I then went to the literature on occupational safety, people who worked on power lines, and found, lo and behold, they also had a higher risk of leukemia, as well as brain tumors and breast cancer among both men and women. And, that just got me onto this, and I began to teach about it, and now I'm actually doing research in it as well.
Wow.
So that's a long answer to your very short question.
No, it's just fascinating. So would you say that childhood leukemia is caused by this, or there's definitely, at the very least, just a correlation?
Well, that's a really interesting question as well. I would say that it doesn't cause leukemia in the sense that it doesn't cause the original damage to the cells. What it seems to do is it seems to promote the growth of cells. Okay. And that's true, if they're cancerous cells or non-cancerous cells. And so if a child develops leukemia for whatever reason, somehow the body's immune system is not as effectively able to deal with it if they're also exposed to an electromagnetic field. So it gives the leukemia a bit of a boost over the body's immune system. And I think that's the reason that the rate is higher for kids who actually are exposed in their homes at power lines.
And so would the leukemia or the damage to the cells, let's just say that, would the damage to the cells be caused or be related only to power lines or to maybe dirty electricity in the wall, or what's the correlation there?
I haven't talked about dirty electricity, so probably most of your listeners don't know what that is. The early studies, let me just go back a little bit because we're sort of jumping right into the middle of the topic. If you look at electromagnetic pollution, I call it pollution, and in Europe it's called electrosmog. We're talking about electromagnetic energy that is non-ionizing. So we're not talking about X-rays or radon gas or gamma radiation or even ultraviolet radiation. we're really talking about levels on the electromagnetic spectrum that are non-ionizing. And that includes radio frequency and extremely low frequency. It could also include light and, infrared, but I tend to focus on the microwaves, the radio frequency, and the extremely low frequency. Within that band, if you look at the biological consequences of this type of exposure, they fall into 4 different categories. The first category is called extremely low frequency electromagnetic fields, or ELF, extremely low frequency EMF, electromagnetic fields. Okay. And this is where the childhood leukemia was first associated with, the low frequency magnetic fields coming from a power supply. They weren't measuring power quality, they weren't measuring anything else. The second area that seems to be important is an area with higher frequencies. This is in the kilohertz range, or thousands of cycles per second. And here, this we call power quality or dirty electricity. And this is something that flows along your wires, and the closer you are to these wires, the greater your exposure inside the home or inside a workplace or inside a school. Mm-hmm. The third area is radio frequency radiation going up to the microwaves. Microwaves is part of the radio frequency spectrum, but at a higher frequency, above 300 million cycles per second, or megahertz. And here we have radiation flowing through the air at a very high frequency. So these 3 areas are really quite distinct. Now there's a fourth, and that's ground current. And this is radiation or electricity that flows through the ground. And it can come into your homes through your plumbing, because everything's grounded to plumbing. Or if you're walking on the ground, it can actually go into your body. And that's how we first learned about it on farms, where cows were, standing on the ground. The electricity was flowing through their body, and it interfered with their milk production and actually caused all sorts of health problems as well. So these 4 areas are critical, and you measure them differently and you treat them differently, and the effects are slightly different, although there's a lot of overlap.
Okay, so which one of those 4 would you presume to be the most dangerous, or is that a valid question? Are they just different?
I don't think that's totally a valid question. I think they're just different. They can all cause problems, and they're not all present in the environment at the same time or, in the same way. So what you would have to do is, if you're concerned about exposure, you would have to measure your environment, and you would measure your environment for those 4 different aspects using, different meters and different methods of measurement. And then depending on what you were exposed to and what the levels were, people can recommend what you can do to minimize your exposure. And some things are, virtually cost you nothing to minimize your exposure. And then other methods are quite expensive depending on what the source is.
Okay, so on top of that, there are different appliances, right, that emit some sort of frequency, like hair dryers or vacuum cleaners, things like that. Are those emitting harmful frequencies as well, or are those pretty innocuous?
No, if you've picked 2 really good ones, actually, Justin. The hair dryer has a very high magnetic field, and it's the same magnetic field that has been linked to childhood leukemia. Now, the amount of time that someone uses a hairdryer is quite limited. So from a home use, I wouldn't be too concerned about it. However, if you're suffering from a brain tumor or breast cancer or even leukemia, I would minimize exposure to things like hairdryers and computers and other devices that emit this low frequency electromagnetic field. If you're a hairstylist, that's quite different because you're going to be exposed for much longer, during the day. So occupationally, it's much more damaging. When it comes to the vacuum cleaners produce something called dirty electricity, and that's been linked to cancer, to various types of symptoms that we now classify as electro-hypersensitivity. And so if you happen to, vacuum your home once a week, it's probably not a big issue. But if you're in the business of housekeeping, for example, and you're using a vacuum for hours each day, then your exposure might be considerable. And there's ways of dealing with the dirty electricity. You can filter it, for example, and basically, minimize your risk.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so later on in the interview, I'd like to get into all the different ways we can mitigate, some of these issues. So if people feel like they're exposed, because there's cell towers everywhere, and there's basically no way to get yourself away from these things, they're basically everywhere. What would you suggest the first thing someone do? Maybe get some meters and start looking into what their exposure actually is?
That's right. The very first thing, well, before we even go to the meters, before you even spend any money, there's a number of things we know can make your home more electromagnetically toxic.
Okay.
And that means if you have energy efficient light bulbs in your home, compact fluorescent lights, for example, they produce a lot of dirty electricity. They emit radio frequencies through the air, and they generate ultraviolet radiation, which is a carcinogen. It's linked to skin cancer. So these compact fluorescent light bulbs that our government is promoting can actually make a lot of people sick. And normally the types of symptoms that we see is skin problems that don't clear up, headaches, dizziness, nausea, difficulty concentrating. So symptoms that we've classified as under the sort of broad umbrella of electro-hypersensitivity. And that includes fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, insomnia, all sorts of things like that. So if you happen to have those light bulbs in your home, my recommendation right now is to go out and replace them with incandescent light bulbs. And I know they're not nearly as energy efficient, but when you have an energy efficient device that makes people sick, then I don't think it's worth it. So my recommendation is stock up on the incandescents until the LED light bulbs become more affordable and better quality. And that's coming. That's just down the road. I'm sure
it is. So now with the compact fluorescents, don't those contain mercury as well? Am I correct on that or no?
Fluorescent bulbs do contain mercury. The mercury is not a problem unless you break the bulb. So the mercury is contained within the glass envelope, and if you break it, if it shatters, if you drop it, or if it explodes, some of these light bulbs are not really well made and they've exploded, then you have mercury in your home. A light bulb has approximately 5 milligrams of mercury, which sounds like a very, very small amount, but mercury is an amazing neurotoxin, and you don't want to be exposed to any of it. It's in a vapor state, so you basically inhale it when you break the light bulb. And the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, if you visit their website, they have information on what to do in the event that you break one of these bulbs in your home. And the first thing is to open all the windows and walk out of the place for at least 15 minutes until the air begins to clear itself. Wow. And then if you've dropped it on carpeting, unfortunately, it absorbs into the carpet and it'll be a regular source. If you've dropped it on a hardwood floor, you can clean it up. And all of the material, including the broken glass that you use, you should put it into, plastic bags, and you should take it to a toxic waste site to dispose of. So we're talking about something that really shouldn't be in your home in the first place, with inside a device that can actually break.
Jeez, wow. Recently, I listened to an interview with Dr. Hal Huggins, and he said that 1 atom of mercury is too much exposure.
Well, the problem is it gets transformed in your body, and if it's methylated in your body, in your digestive system, for example, it can get in through your cells. And if it gets into your brain, then we've got some, real problems. But it's a neurotoxin. You simply don't want neurotoxins in your body. We have enough of it from mercury fillings, which is horrible. So, one of the things we recommend is that people have their mercury fillings placed by a doctor who understands how to do them safely. Eating a lot of fish can increase your mercury content as well. So there are ways of reducing mercury in your body once you have it, but the best thing is to minimize, getting it into your body.
A lot of people use microwaves, and what are your thoughts about the damaging effects of microwave in people's kitchen?
Well, there's 2 aspects of microwaves that are important. One is microwave radiation does not stay within the microwave oven. I've measured quite a few microwaves, and the only microwave ovens, I've only come across 1 oven that didn't leak. So if you're in a kitchen where you turn on a microwave oven, if you're within 10, 15 feet of it, you are being exposed to microwave radiation. Even if you're on the other side of the wall that contains the microwave oven, you're exposed because this energy goes through walls. Cell phones use microwave radiation, and we can get reception inside our house, even though the antenna is outside of our house. So one bit of bad news is that microwave ovens leak, and it's best to go as far away from them as possible if you're going to use it to heat your food. Another concern about microwave ovens is that it denatures food. Because it's working at the sort of molecular level, it can destroy enzymes, and if you're eating dead food, then you're not getting the same nutritional bang for your buck, basically. And so some people refuse to use microwave ovens for that reason alone, that it adversely affects the quality of food. I'm less concerned about that aspect because I know less about it. I'm really concerned about the fact that as soon as you turn it on, you're exposed. And standing in front of a microwave oven and watching your cup of coffee go around and round, when you're heating up for the 10th time, is probably not a good idea, because the part of your body that's most sensitive to microwave radiation are your eyes and your testicles. And your eyes are very, very close to that oven. And the consequence of that are premature cataract formation. So you don't want to have that either.
Jeez, didn't the Russians do a lot of research on microwave radiation and things like that? Because I don't think the Russians use microwaves.
The Russians have done research in this for much longer than we have, and they started looking at the therapeutic effects of microwave radiation. So they started at very, very low levels. We started with microwaves looking at the effects of radar and very high levels for military exposure mostly, and then eventually occupational exposure. The Russian guidelines are 1% of our guidelines. They don't allow you to be exposed to as high levels as we do. So our 24-hour exposure in Russia, you can only be exposed to that for 15 minutes a day, whereas we can be exposed to it for 24 hours. And because of their research, they actually didn't allow their population to use microwave ovens for cooking. They just thought it was too damaging. And they still have better guidelines than we do, and they certainly know a heck of a lot more about the biological effects than seems to be the case here in North America.
Wow, that's fascinating. Jeez, I wish everyone knew this information. Well, we have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. We're with Magda Havas, and her website is magdahavas.com, so make sure to check that out, and we will be right back.
Hi, this is Kate. Thanks so much for listening to the show. I want to tell you about a product I love called Yeast Infection No More. You can find it at extremehealthradio.com/yeast. If you're like me and you've ever had a yeast problem, candida overgrowth, you've had many of the following symptoms like digestive disorders, gas, bloating, skin rashes, allergies, migraines, always being tired, PMS, this is a great system that will teach you how to permanently cure your yeast infection, rebalance your body, boost your immune system, regaining back your life, basically. Successfully used by thousands of men and women worldwide. It's best-selling. It's instantly downloadable. 250 pages of jam-packed advice and instruction. It's backed by over 35,000 hours of intense research. It also is accompanied by a free private mail counseling for over 3 months if you buy the product. What is there not to love about it? Again, find it at extremehealthradio.com/yeast.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us, and we have Magda Havas here talking about electromagnetic radiation. And Magda, I wanted to ask you about some of these things that people have in their houses, dimmer switches, and what are some of the effects of those dimmer switches on the lights they have in their rooms?
Well, dimmer switches increase the amount of dirty electricity that you have. So as you dim the light, what it's doing is it's chopping the electricity to reduce the amount of light that you're getting. And this seems to be making some people sick. So if you happen to be electrically sensitive, the best idea is not to use these dimmer switches, or to plug in filters that can reduce them at the electrical outlet. Interesting.
So you can measure the effect of the dimmer switches as well, right?
Very easily. There's a meter that is inexpensive. It's approximately $100, give or take. And you plug it into an electrical outlet right close to where your dimmer switch is, and then you turn your dimmer switch, up and down, and you can see the meter just change. And it just so happens that some of the dirty electricity that comes into your home through the devices that you have, like these dimmer switches and energy efficient light bulbs, it can actually go into your neighbor's home or come into your home from your neighbors. And we've had people who, live close to each other, and we've had someone, change the dimmer switch in their home, and we can pick up the readings in the neighbor's home. So that's how much it tends to flow along electrical wires. So if you're on the same transformer, you're sharing some of this dirty electricity as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. Recently I've been having the ideas that the electromagnetic radiation, it could be similar to what smoking was 30 years ago.
Very much so.
Okay.
Very much so. I think that's a perfect analogy in that a lot of doctors are unaware that this is harmful, and so they're using their cell phones, and the cell phone industry takes advantage of this. In the past, if you look at any of the old commercials on smoking, you'll see that, doctors recommend Camels, for example, is one of the tactics that they used in the past, and they're using exactly the same thing today. And even with smoking, there's direct smoking, and then there's something called secondhand smoke. And that's true with this radiation as well. So, if you happen to be using your cell phone, it's like smoking. But if you're in the same room with someone using their cell phone, or if you happen to live near a cell phone antenna, then you're exposed to secondhand radiation.
Yeah, and I've heard that it could even be amplified if you're with someone who's using a cell phone in like a train or a car or maybe a plane, right?
That's right. Metal objects reflect the radiation, so the more metal you have around you, the more reflection you're exposed to. So, for example, you asked about the microwave oven earlier. If your kitchen happens to have a lot of stainless steel appliances, then your exposure to microwaves is going to be higher when you turn on your microwave oven, simply because of the reflection. And if you happen to sleep in a bed that has metal frames or has coils, spring mattress with coils in it, and you're exposed to this radiation from other sources, then those coils act like antennas and increase your exposure. That's one of the reasons that, your bedroom should be as clean as possible electromagnetically, so that you have minimal exposure while you're sleeping and rejuvenating.
Wow, so that just made me, what you said right there just made me think of when people have metal in their mouths, like braces or fillings. Do those types of things act as a conduit for electricity?
They do. And actually, there's two really important points here. If you happen to have braces, and they're metal braces rather than plastic or some other compound, that brace will cause the microwaves to reverberate in your head, and so they'll increase the exposure to your skull. So young kids who have braces and are holding a cell phone up to their head, it's probably the worst thing that they could possibly do. And I have a story about this. There was a young girl who was attending a private school in Toronto, and she passed out in the hallway while she was talking to friends, and she's never had any health issues of any concern. And a few days later, it happened again in the same hallway, and it turned out that her head was very close to one of the wireless routers, the Wi-Fi routers they had in the school, and she had a mouthful of braces. So her parents had the braces removed and replaced with non-metallic braces, and now she's fine, although they don't like her being exposed to this radiation for obvious reasons. Regarding fillings, if you happen to have mercury fillings in your mouth, the mercury is actually mobilized. It dissolves when you have microwave radiation exposure. And we found this out. A friend of mine had the unfortunate duty of serving in Vietnam, and he was dealing with radio frequencies there. And one of the things he told me was that the radar operators had to have their fillings replaced, their mercury amalgam fillings replaced every 6 months, because the mercury would dissolve and the filling would become, loose. So it wasn't because they had bad dentists there. It was simply because of what they were exposed to. And there have been a number of studies now showing that mercury levels will increase in your saliva after an MRI scan, magnetic resonance imaging scan, and it will increase in your urine if you use a cell phone, simply because you're mobilizing more of it.
Golly. So now what do you make of all the women then who are having, they're pregnant, but they have their cell phones on them, or I've seen women where they're sitting down at a coffee shop or something and they have their iPhone next to their belly, and it's just what's happening to the child in the womb, do you think, from being exposed to that?
Well, we know the fetus is very, very sensitive, especially during the early stages when, the major organs are developing. And doctors will tell their patients not to smoke, not to take drugs, not to drink alcohol while they're pregnant. And one other thing they should tell them is not to use any kind of wireless device when they're pregnant, or to minimize the use, and certainly to keep it as far away from the fetus as possible. And this should just be regular practice now.
Hopefully it's becoming more mainstream, but it doesn't seem like it when you're out in the world and you just kind of watch what's going on, but hopefully the knowledge is getting out there. So now I wanted to ask you about the role of the electromagnetic radiation and blood sugar, because I've heard that it has a damaging effect on your blood sugar levels.
That's right. We've actually done some work with some diabetics, and this, when I got into this, I came from a chemical toxicology background, so I had to learn everything from scratch, and it was a very steep learning curve, believe me. This is fairly complex physics and fairly complex biology, the biological changes that happen in your body. And I listened to people, because that's how I was getting my information. And one of the things I was told is that some diabetics have problems regulating their blood sugar, and the blood sugar seems to spike when they're exposed to this radiation. So I thought, this is great information, and it's something that's very easy to test because we know how to measure blood sugar. So I began to work with diabetics, and we found that if you're diabetic, one of the people we worked with, I think that's a really good case example, was a woman in New York who was electrically sensitive. She was also a type 2 diabetic, and she regulated her blood sugar through exercise. So she wasn't yet on any kind of medication. Mm-hmm. And she sent me her blood sugar data, and we had her do different things. So if she walked for 20 minutes, her blood sugar came down to normal. It didn't matter how high it was, it came down to a normal level. So walking was a really good way for her to regulate her blood sugar. On days that she didn't feel like going outside and walking, she would work out on her treadmill. So she would walk on her treadmill in her basement. And whenever she did that, her blood sugar would spike. So instead of going down, it would actually go up. And this is contrary to our understanding of what should be happening, because you're exercising your body. It requires the sugar for energy, so it should be burning the sugar rather than increasing it. And it turns out that some diabetics are also electrically hypersensitive, and this produces stress on the body. And when a diabetic patient is stressed, whether it's physical stress or emotional stress, the way they respond is their blood sugar goes up rather than down. And so the doctors who are prescribing exercise to their patients who are diabetic, thinking that they're doing good, should actually tell them to exercise in a clean environment and to minimize their use of any kind of, technology that's plugged in, because that might have the opposite effect. And it turns out that you can actually use this to determine if you're electrically sensitive. So if you are diabetic and you're working out on a treadmill and your blood sugar goes down, chances are you're not sensitive. But if it goes up or it doesn't move, if it stays high, then you probably are electrically sensitive. So you can begin to use this as a diagnostic.
Wow. So in what other ways do you think it affects the body? I guess it's hard to say other than leukemia and blood sugar issues and diabetes, but what other ways do you think it has a bad effect on the body?
Well, we've also worked with people who have multiple sclerosis. There was a school in Wisconsin that had what we would now call sick building syndrome. The students were constantly ill, the teachers were constantly complaining, and the school board basically did nothing about it for quite a long time. And the teachers threatened to call their union in because the symptoms were really quite severe. And when these people went home, or when they were away on the weekend or during the summer, many of their illnesses went away. So that's how they realized it had something to do with the school. And so the school decided to take this seriously, and what they did is they cleaned up the chemicals and the mold and other types of toxins in the environment, And the teachers and students came back in September and they got sick again. So whatever was causing the problem was not removed with this cleanup. And they called in a power quality expert, and he measured the power quality, said that it was high, it was bad, and he plugged in filters to improve it. And these are special filters that you can use inside buildings. The utility is aware of filtering their power quality when they have a problem. So this is technology that's been around for a very long time. And so he cleaned up the power quality. And what was fascinating was in the school, they had a number of students who had asthma and required inhalers on a daily basis. They stopped using their inhalers. So that's one of the other things that seems to have an effect on is asthma. And if you know that young people, the rate of asthma is really quite severe, even though we haven't had worsening of air quality, which is what we tend to associate asthma with. So that was one of the improvements. And the other was the teachers were saying, they had fewer headaches, they had more energy, and so overall people were feeling much better. One of the principals in the school had multiple sclerosis, and her symptoms were very severe. She was actually planning on retiring at the end of that school year because her mind wasn't functioning. She had physical problems as well. She said she couldn't remember the names of her students on bad days. And she realized she couldn't remain being a teacher. And her MS cleared up. Her symptoms went away, and they only came back when she re-exposed herself. So I began to work with people who had multiple sclerosis, and they have all sorts of different neurological symptoms. And we cleaned up their home. We documented their symptoms. And after the first 3 people I worked with, their improvements were so dramatic that I couldn't believe the results, and I was seeing them. And I thought, there's no way that anyone is going to believe this because they were very rapid and really quite significant. And so I began to videotape them. So I would videotape them before we cleaned up their home environment and then after. And these people were so adversely affected by MS that they spent, 24 hours a day at home. They very rarely got out, and they certainly didn't have the ability to work. So we cleaned up their environment, and within days, in some cases, and within weeks in others, they were walking, they stopped using their canes, their tremors went away, they were thinking clearly, they were able to sleep at night, their energy came back, they went off antidepressants. I mean, the results were absolutely dramatic. And so we've got a proposal into the MS Society to see if we can actually repeat this with a larger sample size and do it in a blinded fashion so that, I don't think this was a psychosomatic response. The results were too dramatic. But to really minimize that from a scientific research perspective and see what we get. But the results are truly amazing. So it helps people who are diabetic. Some people who are diabetic, you also have to be electrically sensitive. It helps some people who have MS. You also have to be electrically sensitive. Not every MS patient we worked with improved to that degree. So what we need to determine is what percentage of the population is responding adversely to these frequencies, and what can we do to mitigate their exposure and improve their health.
It scares me when I look out and I see these cell towers next to schools, and I see these pregnant women with iPhones, and it's just, man, it's crazy. So we got to take another break, and when we get back, we've kind of laid the groundwork as to what, why these things are so bad and how they affect the body. So in the next segment, I want to talk a little bit about, what we can do to mitigate some of these things, and there's lots of different things we can do, right?
That's right.
Okay, excellent. We'll take a short break. We're with Magda Havas. She runs a website called magdahavas.com. Make sure to check that out, and we'll be right back. Hey, what's up, everybody? I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Paleo Summit that's put together by our man, Sean Croxton. And this is a summit that took place live over 8 days, and I believe there's 23 video presentations, 23 audio files, 18 hours of cutting-edge information, and 300 pages of transcripts. Now, this program is really an amazing program if you're looking to make some permanent changes in your diet, and if you're tired of struggling with fat loss or weight loss, and you're struggling with food addictions, and you're just looking for a permanent solution, this is definitely something you want to check out. You can find it at extremehealthradio.com/Paleo Summit, and they talk about things like gluten sensitivities, how to curb food addictions and cut back on food cravings, how animal foods and things like cholesterol do not cause heart disease or degenerative diseases, and how to deal with things like bone loss and cancer and muscle pain, autoimmune diseases, and how to burn fat and all that kind of stuff. So if you're looking to change your diet once and for all, definitely check that out. It's extremehealthradio.com/paleo summit. All right, let's get back to this interview. We are with Magda Havas at magdahavas.com. Make sure to check out her website for more information. One last thing, Magda, I want to start focusing on some of the positive things that we can do. But one final thing I wanted to ask you about the cell phones and things like that. From what I've been able to determine looking into this for a few years is that the radiation actually breaks down the blood-brain barrier to especially children. Is that true, or is that something I just read?
No, that is true. That's one of the critical things, is that if the blood-brain barrier is there to really protect the brain from any kind of chemicals that shouldn't be going in there. And one of the things that we found is that there is an increase in the permeability, and this information is now so well accepted that it's being used clinically. So in a clinical environment, if you're trying to get a drug into the brain, it's hard to get it in there because of the blood-brain barrier. And so what doctors are actually doing is they're exposing the brain to microwave radiation first, opens up the blood-brain barrier, and then they deliver the medication. So it's being used therapeutically to help under certain circumstances.
Wow. So because it can also be used in a good way, this is also causing harm to be done to people's brains, right, from the radiation itself, because it opens up that barrier and then the frequencies get in and do all kinds of damage to the brain. Is that kind of how it works?
Well, the frequencies can get in anyway because the frequencies can penetrate through the skull. What we don't want are other chemicals getting into the brain. That's what the blood-brain barrier does. So it allows chemicals that shouldn't be in there to get in there. Wow. And so by holding the cell phone to your head, you're actually increasing potentially harmful chemicals getting into your brain. So that's one of the reasons you shouldn't be putting your cell phone to your head. Wow. But there are safer ways of using your cell phone. Simply move it away and, text and do various things like that.
Wow. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about some of the positive things we can do. I have a grounding mat here, and I have no idea. I've just got it because I've heard it's a good thing, but I've been learning recently that there are times when the grounding mat may not be a good thing. Can you tell us a little bit about what grounding does?
Sure. In the past, people used to walk outside a lot more. They didn't travel in cars. They walked to places. They didn't always have their feet covered, so they were much more in contact and closer to the earth. Now we live in high-rise buildings. We're in cars all the time, so we're disconnected from the earth. And if you walk barefoot on grass that has dew on it, you're getting a really, really good ground connection, and you're equilibrating your body to the earth for the amount of electrons that you have in your body. So you're grounding. This is called grounding yourself. Okay. And normally this is a really, really good thing to do. And that's what the grounding mats attempt to do. Mm-hmm. In areas where you have a ground current problem, which means that there is too much electricity flowing through the ground, if you stand barefoot in one of those areas, then this nasty radiation is coming into your body, and it flows up one leg and down the other, basically. Mm-hmm. And this is what's been causing problems on farms, with dairy cattle and pigs and various other animals. So using grounding would normally be a good thing unless you have a ground current problem. Now, the way the grounding mats are used, you can either plug a metal rod into the ground and ground it that way. That would be the best way to use them. Mm-hmm. Or you attach it to the ground in your electrical circuit, and that's not the best way to use them. And the reason for that is your ground, electrical ground in your socket is actually attached to the neutral at your, where you have your electricity come in. What's that called? Your electrical panel, okay? Right. So at the electrical panel, your neutral and your ground are bonded. And so you can have things going onto the ground that can go into your body. So depending on any kind of errors you have in the grounding system in your building, dirty power that you might have there, that can actually get into your body. So you have to use the grounding technology intelligently. And what I tell people is, if you're using it and you're noticing a benefit, then you're probably okay. If you use it and you're noticing that it's not making you feel any better, and not noticeably, or you're actually feeling worse, then chances are you've got a ground current problem and you shouldn't use that technology in that environment.
Now, is that because there's actual frequencies that the power companies, don't they try to use the ground to get some of their currents going back to them?
That's right. The electrical utility, the wires we have there, the power lines, many of them, in some communities were built 50, 60, 70 years ago, and they weren't designed for our electronic components. And that's one of the problems we're having. So we had a line designed for a totally different type of use. And so what's happening now is that, let me just go back a few steps. You have to have a circuit in order to have electricity, electrons flowing. And so you have something called hot wires and you have something called a neutral. And if you look at any kind of light switch, it has two prongs. One is the hot and one is the neutral, and it sets up a circuit, just like you have in a battery, for example. You have to have both ends connected before you can light a light. What's happening is that the neutral wire that we have with power lines doesn't have the capacity to complete that circuit. And so what the electrical utility has done is they've taken that neutral wire and they've run another wire and they've grounded it. This is, on your pole. You can actually see them on some of the poles. Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is they're putting the electricity into the ground to come back and complete that circuit. So basically what you have is the ground becomes another wire leading the circuit. And this is what's causing the problem. What they should have done is they should have increased the capacity of that neutral by having another wire or by having a thicker wire. This is much more costly, and so they've taken the cheap route, and because of that, it's caused all sorts of problems. Now, I was just at a meeting a little while ago, and I was talking to health and safety people from the electric utility, and one of the engineers came up to me, one of the linemen came up to me and said, well, we ground the neutral to reduce ground current or stray voltage. I mean, he didn't even understand why they were doing it. They're not doing it for that reason, and what they're actually doing is increasing the problem rather than reducing it. So you have this kind of technical lack of knowledge among some of the people who should be experts in this field, which is really quite disturbing.
Yeah, so those people are actually working for the companies that, and they don't even have any idea.
They don't even understand it, which I found to be quite amazing.
So with grounding, it could be extremely beneficial, but you just have to do it correctly, right?
Exactly. With anything, if you do it correctly, if you understand what the parameters are, when it works, when it doesn't, then you can use it intelligently. And some people have made amazing, recovery after they've grounded themselves. I know that some of the engineers and electronic experts, when you're working on sensitive electronic equipment, you have to have a ground band on. Mm-hmm. So you don't want any kind of spark to interfere with what you're doing because it can actually destroy the components that you're working on. So they're constantly grounded. But in some occupations, you're not grounded. And so it's almost like you've charged up. If you work on a computer all day, for example, and you're touching the keyboard, you're connected to the circuit. And those electrons move through your body. They can actually accumulate in your body. One of the things you can do to discharge yourself is to simply take some metal foil, even aluminum foil will work, and stand on it barefoot. And this will draw the electrons out of your body so you don't have an excess charge. And that's what grounding does as well. So you don't have to connect yourself all night long to a grounding mat in your bed. You can simply discharge yourself with any kind of, metal object over a few minutes, and that can do the same trick.
Wow. So you would just maybe stand on, let's say you're in a high-rise building working all day, or maybe you live in high-rise. You could just stand on some of this tinfoil maybe for a couple minutes?
Exactly. The only thing you want to be careful of is you don't do it if you're in an apartment building, for example, that you don't do it under a light, because that light is actually in the apartment below and it's a source of exposure.
Okay. Gosh, there's so much to think about. And, I tend to think that this electromagnetic radiation and all these, frequencies we're being exposed to, it seems to be like just a low level stress on your immune system that eventually it'll just wear your immune system out sooner than it would normally.
That's exactly right. And, the things that we tell people to do who are exposed and who are, feeling adverse effects, and if you want to minimize those adverse effects, there's a number of things you can do. The first thing is you minimize your exposure. So you have to measure it as best you possibly can. If you have wireless technology in your home, you don't have to necessarily measure it, just get rid of it, replace it with something wired. Your cordless phone, for example, radiates 24/7, whether you're using it or not. That big cradle that you put your phone in is producing microwave radiation all the time, even when you're not using it. So that has to be removed and has to be replaced with something wired. Smart meters that are being placed on homes now are making people sick. So you have to try to minimize your exposure as much as possible, and that could include, replacing the technology or putting up shielding material that's available now in paints and films and fabric. So, the technology is really being presented. The countermeasures are being made available to people. So the first thing you do is minimize your exposure. The second thing you need to do is build up your immune system, because it does exactly what you said. It just wears you down. And once your immune system is worn down, then you become susceptible to all sorts of secondary problems, infections, your colds last a long time. You just simply don't recover. You feel tired all the time because your body is so busy trying to, keep homeostasis, and it's probably losing the battle. The third thing you need to do once you've built up your immune system, and that would be with, proper nutrition and exercise and sleep and all the good things that we know work. The other thing you need to do is you have to detoxify your body. And you do that third, because your body won't be able to take the toxic release load if you do it too early. And you could do that with saunas and, various other methods, chelation therapy if it's very, very severe. So those are the three things: reduce your exposure, build up your immune system, and then detoxify your body. And then you're able to tolerate it without symptoms. That doesn't mean you should tolerate it, but at least it means you're asymptomatic.
Gosh, and I've also heard, for our listeners out there who are probably working like I am at a computer all day, I think I heard, I forget who it was, talk about some sort of like rock dust or some sort of, I forget what the substance was that he would put around all of his electrical equipment. Have you heard anything about, I know it's not rock dust, but it might be something similar to that. Do you know anything about that?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I don't know exactly what you're referring to.
Okay, interesting. So it's really a difficult thing to figure out, how much you're being exposed with and how to mitigate it. So now I've heard also that there are things like special types of shirts and, like you mentioned before, paints that you can put on your wall. So those, do they mitigate the electricity in the sense that when the electricity or the radiation hits it, it diffuses it, or does it just deflect it, or how do some of those things work?
Okay, well, first of all, there's film you can put on your windows. So if you happen to live with a cell tower across the street from you, you can, and most of the radiation is going to come in through the glass, although some will come through the wall as well. So by simply covering the glass with a film that I think 3M produces, you can reduce your exposure considerably that way. These products, a lot of them really, really do work. Or you could put fabric on your window. It looks like it's a translucent gauze-like fabric that has silver fiber in it, and the silver reflects the radiation. In both of these cases, they're reflecting the radiation, so it's not coming in. The problem is, if you put this, if you make curtains and put them on your windows or on your walls, and you have a source within your home, then you're actually increasing your exposure, right? Wow. Because it's reflecting it back towards you.
I see.
So you have to be able to measure or have someone professionally install these things and measure them based on your specific environment. Many people tend to want to have a clean sleeping environment. So what they will do is they'll make a canopy that goes around their bed using this silver fabric, and they just put it all around their bed. It's almost like they're in a Faraday cage. It goes around the outside, the top, and the bottom, so you have to totally enclose yourself, and they sleep like that, and that minimizes their exposure during the night, and that can actually help them quite a bit. So depending on what your source is, you have different types of mitigation strategies. There's also paint. that's available. It's a black carbon paint that will do the same thing. It'll block the radiation. It has to be grounded. So you have to have a little metal strip that you attach to the wall and ground to your electrical power supply to draw the electricity away to ground, because it will build up a charge if you don't do it that way. There is clothing you can buy. The clothing was first developed in China because they have the one-child policy, and they wanted to ensure that their kids were going to be, if that one child was going to be healthy. And so the women who were working began to use aprons that had the silver fiber in it. And then they decided that they really wanted something more than just a gray apron, and they began to make clothing. So you can either buy the material and have the clothing done here, or you can have clothing. And you can buy underwear, for example, and that way you can keep your cell phone in your hip pocket, because the radiation the fabric is actually protecting your body.
Gosh, and what do you make of some of this stuff that you can see on like Detzer Electric's website? They have some good products as far as I know. What do you make of some of that stuff?
Well, I've tested his products, and that was before I met Dave Stetzer. And when I mentioned to you that we worked with diabetics and people with multiple sclerosis, it was his filters that we were using that made the difference. So I totally vouch for his filters. It took me a long time to get to the point where I would recommend them in public, because people would think I'm getting a kickback or something, and I'm now promoting a product. And I had to sort of go through this kind of mental exercise, do the filters work? And my answer to that was yes, based on our research. Do you want people to benefit, to improve? And the answer was yes. So I actually decided I was going to come out publicly and talk about the filters. They really do work. And I know there are a lot of copies now, and I have no idea if they work because I haven't tested them. So I can't vouch for anything other than the ones I've tested myself. And for your listeners, I don't get any kind of kickback at all. I can't, because of, my objectivity. So products that do work, I recommend to people, and I don't benefit financially from any of them. And I know the fabric works, I know the film works, I know the paint works, we've measured it, and I know the filters work as well. And it was those filters that were placed in the school in Wisconsin that benefited the students with asthma. So this is really a technology that is there, it works, and it's really quite amazing.
Now, it's almost as if we are just trying to replicate something that's more natural, because our living environments are so unnatural, not just from the EMFs, but from the toxins inside the house. And so basically, we're just trying to replicate something much more natural that we're supposed to be living in.
That's right. The more natural I think we live, the healthier we become. So going into environments, swimming in the ocean where you've got beautiful salt water and you're not near a sewage disposal site, then those are the best things that we can do for ourselves, I think.
Okay, so we got to wrap up here, but I wanted to ask you, in what direction are you headed? Are you working on any new projects, or working on your website, or what kinds of things are you working on?
Well, I'm working on two different things. One is I'm working with people who have developed this electrosensitivity. We think that probably a third of the population is adversely affected to some degree in a minor way. And if we can get doctors to properly diagnose these people and they can make changes in their home environment, their health can improve. Basically, we've got a population in North America that's chronically ill. The amount of prescription drugs that people are taking is astronomical. And we need to change that. We need to get them living more healthily. The other thing I'm looking at is I'm beginning to study the beneficial effects of pulsed electromagnetic fields. So we know that certain frequencies are harmful. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But certain frequencies are actually beneficial. And some of these have been used for decades to heal bone fractures. I recently attended a laser workshop where they're using it for wounds, and the healing of wounds is incredible. The rate of healing, the fact that it reduces pain, particularly for things like burns. So it's using electromagnetic energy and light energy as a method of healing. And I honestly believe that this is going to be the medical technology of the future. This and stem cells, I think, can make a huge difference in the health of a lot of individuals.
Yeah, we just had Dr. David Steenblock, speaking of stem cells, and he's a stem cell researcher and doctor here in California. So, yeah, I agree. I listened to that interview. It was absolutely excellent. And I just came back from a workshop in Thailand that was also on stem cells, and the results are truly amazing. They're actually
able to help Down syndrome kids with stem cells to the point where their facial features begin to normalize. Not only do they improve cognitively, but they physically change. It's absolutely amazing research. So that plus electromagnetic therapies and their various forms, I think, are really better way to go than pharmaceuticals.
Wow, it's so exciting what's going on. So one final question, I didn't get to it, and I know some of our listeners may be thinking about this. Are there people out there like you that someone could hire, for example, if they just think, you know what, this is all very complex, and can someone just come out to my house and fix it? Are there such people out there that do that kind of work?
Yes, there are. There's a group called the Building Biologists, or BAU Biologists, BAU Biologists. They started in Germany, but they're now quite active in North America. And you can look them up and hire one of them to come out and do measurements for you. They're very good at radio frequency radiation and low frequency electromagnetic fields. They're not good with the ground current and the dirty electricity. So, and that's actually easy enough for you to measure the dirty electricity with a $100 meter and a $40, $35 filter. Wow. So that's something that you could do yourself. But the other ones, I would hire one of the building biologists that's local. And I think you can go to their website and it'll tell you who's in which community.
Okay, that's probably buildingbiologist.com or something like that.
Something like that. Their website handy, so I can't give it to you, but something like that. If you do a Google search for building biologists, then that should find it for you.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much. Would you mind holding on while I close out the show?
Yep, my pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I really, really appreciate you spending some time today listening to our show. I hope that you learned a lot of information, and maybe you can take a couple of these nuggets and maybe improve your life in some way. So if you found value in this show, I would really, really appreciate it if you would share this show on Facebook as well as Twitter and things like that. That would help us get the word out even more about this information, because I think it's critical. So thank you for joining us. Also, don't forget we have a store with lots of really, really great products. That's kind of, the main way that we are supporting and trying to stay sustainable here at Extreme Health Radio. So check out our store and see if there's any products that you might like. Also, we are 100% listener supported, so if you'd like to donate, you can donate as little as $1 or as much as you like. So that would be very, very